Good evening and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's live event with Rachel Beanland, author of the novel Florence, Adler Swims Forever. I'm Kathy Jones, one of the Adult Services librarians at the library. We have several author programs coming up this month. Tony Opadesano, professional musician, agent, producer, and longtime pal of Frank Sinatra, will be discussing his new book, Sinatra and Me, in the wee small hours tomorrow evening at 7. And Kate White, author of The Fiancé, will be with us on June 30th. You can learn about and register for all of our programs at hudsonlibrary.org. A reminder that if you're joining us on Zoom, you can put your questions in the Q&A. And if you're watching on Facebook, put your questions in the chat. We'll get to as many as we have time for. Also, the Learned Owl, our local independent bookstore, is selling copies of tonight's book, and there's a link in the chat if you'd like to purchase one. Tonight, I am delighted to welcome author Rachel Beanland. Her new novel, Florence, Adler Swims Forever, is based on a true story about one of her relatives. Amazon Book Review notes, Beanland deftly weaves various historical elements and themes. The rise of the Nazi regime, family secrets, the struggle between classes, religious tensions, sexuality, and familial love. This novel is as close to unputdownable as they come. Rachel is a graduate of the University of South Carolina and earned her MFA in creative writing from Virginia Commonwealth University. Her essays have appeared in Lit Hub, Business Insider, Creative Fiction, and Broad Street, among other places. Tonight, she will be in conversation with author Claire Gibson. Claire's compelling stories of women's experiences have been featured in the Washington Post, the Christian Science Monitor, the Tennessean, Entrepreneur Magazine, and many other publications. Her debut novel, Beyond the Point, was touted by Publishers Weekly as a heartening and heartbreaking story, an ode to the strength of friendship. Please give a warm virtual welcome to Rachel Beanland and Claire Gibson.
Spirit fingers.
Yay! Oh, thank you, Kathy. Thank you so much. And Rachel, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this evening for you and with you, and with all the folks that are watching right now. This is really awesome.
Aw, thank you for doing this. And yes, thank you to the Hudson Library for putting this on.
Absolutely. Well, let's dive in. This book, I have to tell you, Rachel, I came across your work through a woman named Zibby Owens, who has a podcast that we both really love called Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. And I was strolling through my local bookstore in Nashville, Tennessee, and I saw your book and I picked it up and I read the first sentence, which is what everyone always does in the bookstore. And I'm just going to read it out loud right now and then tell you what I thought about it.
All right. I'm all ears.
It says, Gussie Feldman didn't enjoy swimming, but she did like to lie on the wet sand in the shadow of Atlantic City's steel pier and wait for the tiniest ripple of a wave to wash over her. Okay, so I read that sentence and I immediately clutched the book to my chest and I was like, I'm going to love this book and I cannot wait to see what happens. That sentence really grabbed me for a couple reasons, and then I'll stop complimenting you.
Yeah, it's fine. We
keep it coming, right?
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I loved how much of a point of view Gussie had, and as readers will learn, Gussie is a young girl, maybe 8 or 10 years old in the book. Is that right?
Actually in the book.
7. Mm-hmm. She acts a little older.
Precocious 7.
Yes, very precocious 7. I just loved how her point of view comes across right from the very beginning about what she didn't like. How it sets her apart from Florence, her aunt, who obviously loves swimming, and we'll get into that in a minute, and how it sets the stage of Atlantic City. And you get all of that in just that one little tiny piece, and I just thought it was brilliant. So
thank you.
Thank you very much. And the love for this book didn't stop from that point forward. And luckily, you and I had connected on Instagram prior to me reading your book, so then I could actually send you a message and tell you how much I was loving it. And we've obviously
then a friendship was born.
It was, and I love that about. That's one of the only things I love about social media, actually. And I'm really grateful for you as a friend and as a fellow author. because I really look up to your writing.
Well, I could say all of the same things about yours, which I also read recently. And for those of you who have not had a chance to read Beyond the Point, it was amazing. So,
I do want to jump in. You know, Kathy mentioned to everyone that's watching that this story is based on a family story from your extended family. And I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about that. And my book also was a true story that I moved into sort of a novel format. And so I wondered from your experience what that was like, and what were the challenges of taking what really happened and then making, you know, maybe embellishing parts, or upping the drama, or working things out for a timeline. What was that?
That's a great question. So, you know, when my grandmother was a little girl, she grew up in Atlantic City. She, had a childhood much like Gussie's. When she was young, she witnessed her aunt, Florence, drown off the coast of, Atlantic City, off of States Avenue. And that experience became, one of her earliest memories. There's an author's note in the back of the book, and I talk about the two things she kind of remembered from that day. She was 6 when it happened, not 7. But she remembered the red bathing cap that Florence was wearing when she was brought back up onto the beach. And she remembered the sound of her grandmother's wails as she kind of realized like what had just transpired. And that summer, my grandmother was staying with her grandmother because her mother was in the hospital on bed rest. She had lost a baby the summer before. And, when this happened, when Florence died, and my great aunt's name was actually Florence. Her name was Florence Lowenthal. When Florence died, the family made the decision, and the decision was really spearheaded by my great grandmother, to keep this information a secret from my great grandmother, because they were worried, she'd risk losing the baby. They just didn't really know. They thought it was too dangerous for her to, get this kind of horrible news. And so they kind of all went in together on keeping it from her. And this was a story that I always knew growing up. It was kind of like held up as like, if you really love somebody, then this is the kind of sacrifice you're willing to make. Like, you're willing to walk into a hospital room and act like everything's okay, when in reality, you're grieving this tremendous loss. And, I kind of took the story at face value when I was young, but then as I got older, I really questioned it, because I started to put myself in the position of Fanny in the hospital bed. And we're just going to, for tonight, I always feel like I have to do this disclaimer. Let's just stick with character names, because it gets way complicated if I start calling them all by their real names. But I started to put myself in the position of Fanny in this hospital bed, not knowing, not having any clue. And I thought, man, she really was robbed of something, like the ability to kind of grieve her sister's death in real time. And so that was the part that like I kept coming back to, was this idea of, of exploring this and thinking about what it would potentially be like to have been there. The second part of your question, like this,
actually putting it on paper.
Yeah, right. Like the challenge inherent in that. I'd be curious to hear how it worked for you. Like, what I told myself was that I was writing fiction, and like that my first job was to write the best novel that I could write. And so what I gave myself permission to change what I needed to change, to, create these kind of like fully fictional characters. But one of the reasons I was able to do that was because I didn't actually know any of these characters, with the exception of my grandmother. Like my grandmother was the only generation I would have known, and I didn't know her as a little girl. So what about you? Because you were telling like a more contemporary story.
Well, I'm curious, did you go to your mother? I'm assuming that your grandmother had passed by the time you started to write this book. Is that correct?
So she hadn't.
Oh, wow. Go grandma. Okay.
So, well, I was a chicken. So, she was alive. She died when she was 94, just a couple of years ago, and she was alive when I started to write the book. And when I was thinking about writing the book, I talked to her several times about kind of what it was like growing up in Atlantic City, and what it was like to, we talked a couple of times about the story of Florence's drowning. And, she knew I was writing about Atlantic City, but I was too scared to tell her, like, I am fictionalizing the most horrible day of your life. Like, I just really was scared to do it. My mother knew. And I think, my mother probably would have like preferred me to pick a different story, but she was ultimately very supportive of kind of like the overall like dream of writing a book, and she was, I think, flattered like that it was going to be based on, her family. And the story was very important to her too. So she was intrigued by the fact that like I wanted to do something with it. Now, when my grandmother started to get sick, this was about midway through writing the book. So I had, I don't know, I probably had like 150 pages or something like that. My mom did say, like, Rachel, I got to tell her, like, I have to tell her that this is what you're writing about. She was visiting. And I think it's very flattering that I think my mother just believed it really would be a book. And like, she was like, well, I got to tell her, I don't want her to die and not know that this is like happening. Right. So she did tell her. And so my grandmother did know. And she never knew it sold or, any of that business, but she knew what I was writing. And she was so matter of fact and so funny and humble, and just like, she was a real character. That her big reaction when my mom told her was like, why would anyone want to read that? Like, she just couldn't see how like that the story would be fictionalized, or like why it would be interesting, and no one thinks their own life is interesting. Right. And she was right there with that.
Yes. Well, I totally beg to differ with your grandmother, because I was completely captivated by the Adler family. And truly, by the end of the novel, felt like I knew them so well, and really wanted to see where they all ended up, and wanted to know more. And but anyway, we'll get into that in a second. But I would just, to answer your question about Beyond the Point, it was a little bit different for me because everyone that I wrote about was still living, and so I definitely had them on my shoulders in some ways of like, I really wanted to do it justice so that they would be proud of it. And the women who attended West Point that I wrote about, many of them were able to come to the book event because my book came out pre-pandemic, and that was really special to me, to feel their support and to feel like they were proud of it. And there are some women in the book that were not happy with certain scenes or how they came out. But at the end of the day, I had to give myself permission to make it fiction as well, and to amp up certain things and to let other details go for the sake of the story. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally, you always have to be kind of true to the narrative more than anything else, like the fictional narrative, because if that storyline's not there, like, you don't have a book, and I know for me, one of the biggest things that I changed, that my mom was like, what are you doing, was I took what would have been my great grandfather, Isaac, in the book, and without giving too many spoilers, like, he doesn't turn out to be such a great guy in the novel.
Every novel needs a bad guy, right?
Right. And when my mom read it for the first time, she was like, what did you just do to my grandfather?
How dare you?
Like, he's not your grandfather exactly.
This other guy? Yeah. Well, let's talk about the cast, because this is actually quite a large cast.
Yeah.
You've got 7 different characters, and I know, because this is something you and I have talked about, you really committed to a very firm structure at the beginning of the writing process, where you have the whole book takes place over the course of a summer. It also takes place over the course of Fanny's bed rest. So we have a birth that happens at the end of the book. Spoiler, she's pregnant. Duh. And so you have these 7 characters, and each chapter kind of cycles through their point of view. And I'm a sucker for novels that have a really firm structure. Amor Towles' Gentleman in Moscow is one that I just dissected to death. I don't know if you've ever read that book, but
I've read his first one, but not that one. And I have it on my bookshelf. Now I'll have to go look at it because I also
Gentleman in Moscow. It covers 30 years of history, and it's very methodical how he does it. We can talk about it later if you're curious. But anyway, I thought the way that you covered this span of time and gave equal playing time to each of your characters was really brilliant. And so for those who haven't yet picked up the book, we've got Gussie, who's this 7-year-old girl who witnesses her aunt's drowning. Esther and Joseph, who are Florence's parents. They're her surviving parents. Fanny, who's Florence's sister, who is on bed rest. Isaac, who is Fanny's husband, who is a little bit delinquent and not doing such a great job as husband and dad. Mm-hmm. And then you have Stuart, who's a lifeguard at Atlantic City and a friend of Florence's during her lifetime. And then you have, I find, one of the more interesting characters in the book, and I want to talk about her, and that's Anna. And Anna is a young woman who has come from, is it Austria? Is that correct?
Germany. She's come from directly from Germany, but yeah, her background is
to the United States to live with the Adlers for the summer because she is fleeing Nazism, trying to find her way to a university so she can have permission to stay in the United States. And all the while, Joseph Adler, the patriarch of the family, is also trying to find a way to bring Anna's mother to the United States. And all of this, of course, leaves his wife, Esther, a little perplexed. Like, why do you care so much about these women in Germany?
Right.
So I just want to talk a little bit about Anna's character. I wasn't sure from your author's note whether or not how true to life her story was, and I'd love to know more about how you researched that part of the story.
Yeah. So, I always knew that I would write the book in rotating perspectives, and I knew that I would have this kind of big cast. I was nervous about writing such a big cast, but I kind of quickly began to feel like that was just the only way to do it. And Anna was probably like the last character that I knew I needed. Like I knew I had to have this kind of core family. Certainly I knew I needed all these women, the Florence naturally, Fanny of course had to be in that hospital bed. I needed the mother. And then as I started to build out the family, I figured out, I needed a person or two that were where they were on the outside kind of looking in to the family, because we have this book that's about grief, but it's also about a lot more than grief. And it's, I felt like I needed to show kind of a lot of different sides to who Florence was and what this family was missing out on. And so Anna was really useful for me because she was not only, she was a person from the outside looking in, but she was also plunked down in that household, whether she wanted to be or not, right? Like, it's always awkward being a house guest under the best of circumstances. But, as soon as you're a house guest in the middle of like such a horrendous situation where you have nowhere to go, it just, to me, that felt like such a tense place for her to be. And such a great window into this family. And then Anna was also really useful for me because she was exactly Florence's age. And so I had this kind of trick that I was trying to pull where I knew, I had this title character, Florence, who was going to die very early in the book, and she had to, because the story was really about what happened after she died, this secret and everything that results from the secret. And so Anna was helpful because she was exactly Florence's age and became like a foil for her, where she's interacting with all the people in the family who would have been interacting with Florence, so you got some sense, I felt like, as the reader, of, how Florence might have interacted with Gussie, or how she might have interacted with her father, or Stuart, her swim coach, or, all these different people in her life. And so in that way, I kind of thought that Anna helped keep Florence alive for the duration of the novel.
And then I feel like she also offered a lot of opportunities to discuss the historical time period and what was happening in the world. So much of the book happened in Atlantic City, but then also because Anna was a part of the cast, you open up your lens a bit and you hear about Germany, and you are able to talk about this Jewish family in America, their bakery that they own, and obviously a lot of the freedoms and sort of stability they're able to have, while meanwhile across the ocean you've got an entire generation of Jews that are fearing for their lives, running for their lives, and literally about to be murdered. And so I think that tension really amped up for me my fear for Anna, my fear for her family, and then also my sadness for the Adler family as they experience anti-Semitism right in their own community.
Yeah, and I think that that's an interesting thing about writing about Jews in America or elsewhere in the years leading up to World War II, because, I certainly did not set out to write a World War II story. It's set in 1934. It's not, it's not really about World War II, right? It can't be about World War II. But because of everything we know that's coming, it does create this automatic tension that you can't get away from if you're writing about Jews during this time period. They don't know what we know as the reader, and that's one of the keys to creating tension in any novel, right? Is give the reader some information that the characters don't know. And so I think it's actually really hard to write anything set in that time period that wouldn't kind of layer on this natural tension, for sure. But I mean, I did a lot of research on of course, what was happening in Germany, but also specifically on immigration and really looking at what it took to become an American at that juncture, and how difficult it was for, Jewish Germans and others to get to the United States. I was under the mistaken impression that it was Germany that was making it so hard for people to immigrate during this time period, and it really wasn't. It was the U.S. State Department that was creating just unnecessary hurdles.
Barriers. Yep. And I think you do a really great job in the novel of describing those barriers and also guiding your characters in ways that are unexpected. And I really, really connected with that. I want to talk a little bit about grief. And I want to read a little page. This comes from early in the book, just after Florence has drowned. It's on page 30, actually. So people who haven't read it, don't get mad at me. I'm not spoiling anything.
It really is not a spoiler to say Florence dies in this book.
No, she dies on, I think, page 10, sad, Lord rest her soul. But no, I really appreciated the ways that you wove Jewish tradition, and particularly the rites after a death in the family. And so this little paragraph is about Esther, Florence's mother, just after Florence has drowned. And I'll just read it. It says, "Before Esther draped the mirror in her own bedroom, she studied her reflection. Her hair was gray and had been since the girls were small, but for years it hadn't mattered. Her face had looked young, and inside she still felt like the 19-year-old girl who had once been so bold as to ask Joseph, a handsome young waiter at Chortney's Hotel, to go for a walk. Joseph and she had married and started the bakery. The girls had been born and grown up. Fanny had married and had Gussie. Florence had gone away to school, and the house had grown quiet again. How often had Esther remarked to Joseph, 'I can't believe I'm old enough to have a married daughter,' or 'to think I'm a grandmother, how can this be?' Now, as she rubbed her hands against her temples, pulling the puffy skin around her eyes as tight as she could, she felt every one of her 49 years that had marched across her face. Esther threw a sheet over the mirror, disgusted with herself. Jews covered their mirrors during Shiva to prevent exactly this kind of shallow reflection." So you do a few things in that paragraph that are a study in good prose. Number one, you give us a view of Esther in this mirror. You give an entire backstory to Esther's character, how she and her husband met, what kind of life they've had, how she feels about being an old woman of 49.
49.
Yes. And then also in that short, I don't know, 6 or 7 sentences, you give this great explanation of Shiva. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And why, and the whole explanation behind the rite of why you would throw a blanket over all your mirrors in your house, which might seem sort of superstitious or weird to people who aren't Jewish, but to read that whole paragraph and then go, oh, that actually makes so much sense. And so I'm curious from your point of view, because I'm under the impression that you are also a practicing of the Jewish faith, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Practicing is like the right. The quote.
Trying to be faithful.
Trying to be practicing.
Yeah. So from your perspective, what was it like to write about your faith through this book? And how do you think practices like Shiva and other traditions that you write about throughout the book help people who are experiencing grief or hurt people that are experiencing grief?
Yeah. It's fun. So my background, just, for anyone who's Jewish reading this or not Jewish, is that I was raised in an interfaith. My parents were interfaith. My mom's Jewish. My dad was Methodist, raised Methodist. But he was pretty non-practicing, and so we were raised Jewish, and my siblings and I. And then I married a nice boy who'd been raised a good Catholic, and he was pretty darn non-practicing as well. And so he's allowing me to raise like a second generation of Jewish kids in this like interfaith, mishmash or whatever. And so I've had this kind of like interesting relationship with Judaism my whole life, where it's like, oh, I'm Jewish, but then like there's some basic things I don't know, or I think I don't know things, and then like it turns out maybe I do know them because I just have picked them up through my family, but not really understanding that I knew them. And so when I set out to write this book, I didn't necessarily feel like I had to write a Jewish family. I wasn't trying to kind of do anything particular with the Judaism initially. I just was really fascinated by this family story. And, there were certain things that I didn't want to change just because it didn't feel like they needed to be changed. And so I would say that the Adler family's Judaism was one of those things that, it had happened in a Jewish family, and I just kept it and was like, yeah, it's a Jewish family. And for me, that meant that, sometimes I had to go out and actually like really research my Judaism to make sure like, okay, is that really what we do at this time? And like, how does this work? And, and then sometimes I surprised myself by like knowing more than I thought I would. But it really wasn't until I got to the end of the book and looked back on the Judaism and, what had kind of worked its way into the book and what I had kind of taken the opportunity to explore, that I really realized like how pivotal it was that this family was Jewish as I was, for this particular story, because the traditions in Judaism, particularly when it comes to grief, are very prescribed. Like there are particular things people do, right? Like during the week of Shiva, after Shiva. Like, so what I found was that there was something really poetic about the fact that this family who has all of these traditions that they could fall back on are denying themselves these traditions, like in order to keep the secret going, right? And so by keeping the secret and by insisting that the secret is the most important thing, they're actually really denying themselves something. Like in a way that if I had just kind of written a non-practicing family or maybe a family of a different faith, they might not have been denying themselves such kind of a valuable like commodity almost.
Yes, and one of the scene that I remember the most in around that is when Joseph shuts himself in his office and decides he's going to practice Shiva, even though they're trying to hide this, and even though they're trying not to, and they're trying to go about in the community without, following these rituals and burying their daughter right away, and they're not doing any of those things. And so that really stuck out to me, just that image of him sitting alone in his office with the door shut.
Yeah, I think like what I tried to do with Joseph was write a character who was really dedicated to those practices. And as someone who is really dedicated, he kind of found ways to integrate them even with the secret. And whereas Esther is so focused on keeping the secret that she denies herself everything. And that's where a lot of the tension comes in for that couple, is that, one of them is kind of finding ways to grieve and the other one is not. And, as we all grieve so differently, regardless of what our faith is and regardless of how close we are as a family, that I thought that relationship with the two of them was a great way to explore that.
It was really, really good. So since we're on the topic of secrets, this book is full of them. And there's the big secret that you've already revealed, which is about, keeping this secret of Florence's death from her sister Fanny, who is on bed rest. But Florence has a secret, and Stuart and Anna later in the book kind of have a shared secret, and Isaac has a lot of secrets, and Joseph has this secret from his past that he keeps from his wife. And I just was curious, so you said at the beginning that this story about Florence's death always was told to you in this way, that what said, if you really love your family, you would be willing to do something like keep this secret. And I just would love to hear, because after reading the book, there was a tiny part of me that just said, can you guys just all get in one room and just tell the truth, please? Which I've basically...
That is not the way. That is not our family's way.
Clearly, since you didn't want to tell your grandmother you were writing the book, right? You kept a secret too.
Right.
But do you think humans really hide this much from each other?
I've done enough of these book events to feel like people are like 50-50 on it. Like, I hear from readers who say, this would never have flown in my family. We tell each other everything. Like, I don't know where these people get off, right? And then I hear from readers who are like, yep, this was my family. Like, it's like you tore a page out of our book. This is how we operate. And people will even tell me, it's funny, like, I'm like their confidant now. Like, they will tell me their secrets. Like, like I've gotten emails and notes with like great juicy secrets.
Maybe that's good content for the next novel.
Yeah. And so, I think like families are really divided on it, and maybe it comes from like, did you grow up in a family where there was a secret like this that was being kept, and then what did that do to you? I feel like I veer more towards transparency because of the way that I've kind of seen my family take this secret and then other kind of subsequent secrets and run with them. Always not, it's always been with justification that we're doing it for someone's benefit, like that we want to protect them, that we want to kind of do what's right by them. But it's hard to know what's right for people sometimes. And
right. And people are a lot stronger sometimes than you give them credit for.
Exactly. And it's like, you won't ever know how strong people are if you're protecting them from everything. All the time.
Protecting them. Yes. I come from a much more frank and open family. And my husband comes from a much more like, don't rock the boat, hold tight to your information family. And that causes a lot of tension between the two of us because we're dealing with each other's families. He's like, God, can your family not talk about, X, Y, or Z? And I'm like, what's the deal? And and with his family, there's moments where I'm like, can everyone just get in the same room and just talk about it? Like, why can't we just be open, you know?
Yeah, and the funny thing is, I really did think when I wrote this book that I was going to come down pretty harshly on Esther for keeping the secret. Like, I just, if you'd asked me up front, I mean, it's not, I didn't have the whole thing outlined or anything, but I had a vision of some sort of a scene at the end, you know, that Esther was going to be in, and I just thought, like, she's going to have to figure out that this was so wrong, you know? And by the time I kind of got to the end of the book, it's like I did have some level of sympathy for her, you know? I mean, I'd spent a long time in her shoes, and those were not fun shoes to be in. And, you know.
And she's trying to save what little she has left of her family in some ways.
Yeah. No, I had a lot more empathy for her as the book, you know, kind of reached its natural conclusion.
Well, that's a good segue. We have a couple questions that came in through the folks that are with us tonight. And Christine is asking how long it took to write the book and wants to know a little bit about your writing process.
Yeah.
I do too. I can always learn from someone else's writing process. So.
Well, okay. So my writing process is constantly evolving because, of course, like my life has changed a lot in the last couple of years. But for a very long time, like 9 years or so, my process was that I woke up every day. It used to be 5 a.m. For a while, it was 5. And I would write from 5 to 7. And then I would get my kids up and I would get them out the door. And, you know, I worked full time always. And so, you know, it was a constant like rush insanity to like get everyone where they needed to be. And then I would drive them all around after daycare or school or whatever to all their activities and stuff, and then I would just fall into bed exhausted. And then when I started writing this book, I did the math on like how much I was capable of writing between 5 and 7 in the morning, and I was like, I'm going to be working on this novel for freaking ever. And so I wound it back to 4:30 a.m. so that I could get an extra half hour in. So I did that for 2 years. I started writing the book in the fall of 2016, and I finished in the fall of 2018. And that was really the only time I had, aside from when I dropped my kids off at Sunday school. One of the wonderful things about being Jewish is that you do not go to services when your kids go to Sunday school. So, like, that's a plus. And so I would go to the library and just hole up and write during that time as well. So that was kind of my schedule. And then the book sold and I ended up quitting my job and I was finishing an MFA. So I had a year where things were crazy. And then, oh, by the way, there was a global pandemic. I don't know if you heard.
Oh.
And
was that why we're here on this computer?
Has that changed your life at all? So my children, so my kids now are 16, 13, and 8. So they all, March 2020, they came in our house and they didn't leave. They still have not left. Our school district has been closed this whole year, you know, virtual 100%. So that has been crazy. And so I've been breaking up the day with my husband. So like I write in the morning and I have to be done by noon, and then he goes in and does his stuff in the afternoon. So that's been the setup now. And then this summer is the first time that everyone will be like in a camp or a thing. So I'm hoping to like actually be writing during like daytime hours and have a little more time. And who knows? I mean, this school year, it could really rock if everyone can just go somewhere else. But, you know, but I guess like whether you have kids or don't have kids, I mean, like the gist is that, you know, life changes, things change. No process is so precious that like it can't shift, right? But I do like to write every day. I try not to take days off because it is hard. You lose the thread of the story. Like, I think it helps to just kind of constantly be noodling on it, even if you're not, you know, writing the best words of your life. And I do think it helps to even write at the same time every day, because if you can, I think it's like muscle memory. You just sit down and you're like, okay, this is the time when I open the floodgates and let it out. But location, like I'm pretty flexible on my location. I will write in a car. I love like going and parking somewhere where I don't have Wi-Fi. I've started writing at the snack bar at my pool. Like,
nice.
You know, wherever I can.
Distracted, so I'm impressed by that for sure. That's
I
incredible.
listen to white noise of airplane sounds, which is horrible, but it does the trick. So, what are your tricks?
Oh, I do like the same time every day. I think that that's really important. I think giving yourself we talked about this offline, but giving yourself a manageable word count that you're really shooting for. And some days I get to that word count and that's all I got, and it's not great, didn't feel right, but I did it. And I have this thing on I have a little whiteboard right here, and it says what you did today was enough, and you'll try again tomorrow. Like, just letting it be and moving on with your day. And then what I'm working on now, again, as you know, is just really continuing to move forward. It can be really challenging for me. And you and I are both working on second novels, and I want you to talk a little bit about your second novel, but it can be challenging to want to go back and fix chapter 1 that I wrote in light of what happened in chapter 4. I know there needs to be a change, and that can be really like a crapshoot because you just get mired in fixing something before you even really have a full story. So I'm working on that.
That was a big rule for me with Florence Adler, and it wasn't my rule to start out with. I adopted it from Tom DeHaven, who led the novel writing workshop I was in initially when I started working on the book. But he just said, you write forward. Don't go back and edit. If you decide, after a chapter or two that something major has shifted, you just make a note on the margins and say, something big has shifted, and you just keep going with this new shift, and you don't go and edit the old pages. And I do think that's also very good advice.
I do too. It's definitely helped me move forward quite a bit. So one question that came through is whether or not you ever considered writing Florence Adler Swims Forever as nonfiction.
Yeah. I did for a hot minute, but I had been working on a lot of nonfiction before I started Florence Adler. And one of the things that I loved about starting Florence Adler was I was ready for a fiction project. I was ready because the challenge, of course, with nonfiction is when you get to a hard part, you can't make anything up. If the narrative's not quite flowing, or it's not there's not enough tension, or there's not enough whatever, you're kind of trying to figure out how do I drum this up? What do I do? And so for this, it was so wonderful for me because I was oh, I can do whatever I want. If there's not enough tension in a scene, I can go back and add more tension. So I was very excited about the prospect of writing fiction. And I think I kind of stumbled upon something that I really do enjoy. I mean, I like reading fiction, so it's not a big surprise that I would like writing it. But there was a second part of this question, I feel like. One thing I was going to say was that with this particular story, I had enough details to write an article about her death, or something, and what it had done to my family. But I did not have much more than that in me for nonfiction, and I have written a couple of essays since then, about different things that I kind of took away from the real life story. But it wouldn't have been enough. And so I always felt
totally understand that. Yeah,
I felt like it needed those other secrets, those other kind of storylines bolstering it. And so fiction just worked much better.
So tell us a little bit about your next novel that you're working on.
Okay. So I am working on another historical novel. It's not intentionally, I just have accidentally fallen into this historical hole. I can't promise how long I'll stay here, but this one is historical. It is set in my own backyard, Richmond, Virginia. It was kind of the product of COVID. I had been thinking about something else that would have required a lot of travel, and in March of 2020, I said, you know what, it might not be a good time to go anywhere. So the story is based on another true story that occurred in Richmond in 1811. So I'm going pretty far back. There was a really large theater fire that happened in Richmond the night after Christmas, 1811. There were 600 people in the city's theater when a prop caught on fire, and by the end of the evening, 72 people were dead. Of those 72 people, the majority were women. And there was a lot of talk afterwards about why so many women had died. Was it like that their dresses impeded their escape, or were there more women up in the box seats were the ones that did the worst in this? And of course, the elephant in the room that no one wanted to kind of talk about was that the men had just climbed over their wives and daughters to get out of the theater. And so, I'm following a cast of characters in the days after the fire, and in a lot of ways, it feels like I'm on kind of familiar ground, even though it is not Atlantic City and it is not, the Adler family. I'm definitely looking at grief and our kind of collective grief, and instead of looking at how a family grieves, I'm looking at how a whole city is grieving. So that's what I'm working on.
I also am excited because knowing a little bit about your story, I see some similarities in the fact that you've chosen 1811, which is a time frame right before quite a big conflict in U.S. history, in the same way that you chose this time period, or the story,
Right.
was in this time period of 1934, just before this world conflagration. So I think those choices really lend you a lot of conflict and a lot of tension and a lot of just fertile ground. So.
Yeah, Richmonds history in this time period is really fascinating. And what's interesting is that Virginia in that time period was having such a large effect on the whole United States that kind of what happened in Virginia was happening to the whole country. And, the country was only 35 years old. So this fire had really big repercussions. So I'm in it. I'm deep in it. Wish me luck. You're going to be hearing a lot more about it. The rest of the people in the audience, we'll have to wait. But
every time I hear any momentum, any excitement, any inspiration from you, it helps. I just think you're an incredible writer, and I think any time that I feel, and this is just being honest, but anytime I feel a pang of jealousy or like something toward another writer that has a great book that came out. Often it's because I haven't read the book. Once I go read the book, I'm like, oh, they're amazing. They need to write all the books. And so I that's my own, stuff I have to work through. But that's how I feel. I read this book and I'm like, I just cannot wait to read what you write next. I can't wait to just see all the stories that you have to tell, because I think you're such a gifted writer, and I really cherish this story, and I can't wait to see what happens next with your career. But there are a couple more questions. One, I don't want to do any spoilers. So Laura asked, why did you end the book the way you did? But I'll ask sort of, do you know what happens a bit beyond the pages?
Yeah, I can kind of talk around that without giving too much away. Sometimes people ask this question, and what they're really getting at is like, is there a sequel coming? Like, because there were some hanging threads, right, that were left. There's no sequel, on the horizon. I'm not saying never, but right now, I'm working on something else, and I don't know about that. I will say, I did hear from a man who graduated from high school with my grandparents. Well, he actually graduated the year before them, so he's 98 now. And he's an incredible emailer. And so he and I have had this whole correspondence going now for several months. He remembers as a teenager meeting my great grandfather, who died in 1939. Like, this is great. Like it was like a mind-blowing intro. He read the book. Someone was, he grew up in Atlantic City. So someone passed him the book and said, you have to read this. And so we've been having this whole back and forth. And I told him that, if I ever returned to the Adler family, that I would likely move forward in time, like to Gussie, kind of coming of age. Like their Atlantic City continues to be super interesting, like in the 40s and 50s and on. And so I think I would probably move forward a little. And so he's been just sending me all these great anecdotes about like what it was like in the 40s. And, because of course a lot of the beach hotels got turned into hospitals for soldiers, and there was a lot going on there. So I think that would be like where I would land, if I was going to return to the Adler family. There is a particular question that like I know is sitting in this question from this reader, and what I will just say is that there was a craft issue with giving this reader what they wanted. if I can be so vague, in that, in order for the reader to get what they wanted, they were going to have to listen to a lot of retelling of information that they already knew. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the reasons that I avoided the scene that I think they were hoping for. But that's what I can say.
Yeah, that's sort of what one part that I would love. But I also know that that would be full of grief, right?
Yeah.
And we just spent an entire book about grief, and basically to see that again would feel like kind of starting over the process.
Yeah, I felt like, so, I always hesitate because I say that this is a book about grief, and I mean, it certainly is. This is a family that is like deep in their grief during the whole book. But I mean, one of the reasons that I wrote it from rotating perspectives was because I didn't want the book to feel too heavy. Like I wanted us to be able to kind of move in and out of people's grief, and also be able to capture kind of some of the lighter moments in a family, and some of the moments, as we all know, if you've lost someone, like you can't be like devastated every moment of every day. It's just not possible. Like you have to also eat dinner and do random things and take your kids somewhere, and like there are these things that just kind of have to happen. And so the beauty of having 7 characters was I was able to kind of shift and say, okay, we're going to follow Gussie for a little while, or we're going to follow Isaac, who is maybe up to no good but also is like not grieving in the same way that someone like Esther or Joseph is. And that I thought really helped add like a tone of lightness to the book, and
Stuart's storyline did the same thing, and he actually ended up being one of my very favorite characters in the book. I just felt so just grateful he was in the cast too.
He's a charmer. Can you tell I was a lifeguard in high school, and like I have kinds of lifeguard feelings.
Okay, in Atlantic City.
Not in Atlantic City.
No. Oh, I was gonna say that seems like it would have been very, very hard.
No. Atlantic City, I mean, beach lifeguarding is tough. I was a beach lifeguard one summer, but on the Chesapeake Bay where there are no waves. So that was doable. But no beach.
Speaking of your background, that's our last question for the evening, is a little bit more about your life outside of writing. What do you enjoy doing? Do you swim? I know several of your children are doing swim team. Do you swim?
No, I mean, no.
Or other hobbies that you enjoy?
I have a friend who called in for this one, or zoomed in, and she's gonna really be like laughing. No, I should swim. That would be really great because I sit at a pool like every day with my kids, and the lap lane is just over there.
But you're at the snack bar writing your next novel.
I'm at the snack bar writing my next book, which is
just as important,
right? I did swim when I was young, and so my dad was in the Navy, so I grew up, I was always near water, and swimming was always like a big part of my life, so it was easy to kind of put myself in the headspace of Florence and a swimmer. And certainly I was very interested in all the research I had to do for open water swimming and kind of these women like Trudy Etterly who were swimming the English Channel. Like I found that all super fascinating. But I definitely came at it more from like the lifeguard perspective than the competitive champion swimmer perspective.
Right. Well, what else do you enjoy doing in your free time now? Do you have any favorite TV shows? Laura W. was asking.
So I'm watching Dead to Me with the kids, which I shouldn't be doing. Like my children should not be watching that show. But we're all watching it together as a family, which is horrible. Yes, I understand.
That's a show about family secrets too.
Yeah, there's some real family secrets happening there. And I mean, I'm really reading a lot. Like I always am reading. That's like my hobby. It's interesting when your job and your hobby are the same thing, right? So right now I'm reading The Other Black Girl, which I am adoring.
Yeah, I read it. We'll have to talk about that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I'm close to the end. And I think next up for me is revival season. I'm super.
I have it right here, actually.
Yeah, I know. My copy is all like greasy and my cover is like gone. So, but this is next up is revival season by Monica West. And yeah, so I'm usually like reading something. I used to travel before COVID, but we still have one kid who's not vaccinated, so I don't know.
Waiting on that. How old is your youngest that's waiting on the vaccination?
She's 8, so
it might be a minute. Yeah, we'll see.
Mm-hmm. But the other 2 are good to go. We got our checks on those ones. So,
do you want to share a weakness food that was in the list that Laura was curious about? Mine are milkshakes. I had one last night.
The things I eat when I'm writing are I eat a lot of wasabi peas, which are not good for you and I shouldn't do. I eat a lot of chewy candy like Sour Patch Kids. Anything that kind of like keeps me awake and just the sugar kind of like constantly, sugar or salt, like constantly streaming.
Oh man, well thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I could go on and on and on. I love talking with you and I'm so grateful that you invited me to be a part of this evening, and thank you for everyone who was a part and asked questions, and again to Hudson Library and Historical Society for hosting Rachel. And I just really want to encourage everyone again to pick up a copy of this book from the local bookseller. And Kathy, you can share a little bit more about that.
Yes, the book is available at the Learned Owl in Hudson, and there is still a link in the chat if you would like to purchase one. I also highly recommend it. It's a great read, and I appreciate it even more having listened to this discussion. So I want to thank you both for being here tonight and sharing your experiences in your writing and everything with us. We appreciate it so much. Thank you to all our patrons who joined us tonight, and hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow night at our next author program. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you guys for hosting. This was wonderful. Thank you, Claire.